The canyon did not breathe. It held its breath, a great stone lung waiting for a dawn that was slow to bleed across the eastern rim. Wind, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, scoured the dust from the hardpan, worrying the edges of the saltbush and whispering lies to the skeletal junipers. It was a land of absences, defined not by what it held, but by what it had lost to time, to sun, to the relentless, thirsty air. Light, when it finally came, was not a comfort but an indictment, laying bare the scars on the land, the deep, ancient wounds that looked like cracks in the very firmament of the world. Into this silence, this vast and hollow cathedral of rock and ruin, they brought her. She sat on the wagon seat, a small, still thing wrapped in a dusty shawl, her hands folded in her lap like sleeping birds. She was not a person but a parcel, a debt paid in flesh. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in the landscape not with fear but with a kind of weary recognition. She had seen emptiness before. It lived inside her, a quiet tenant in the hollowed-out rooms of her heart. The men on either side of her were noise and sweat and rank tobacco, their laughter a series of small, ugly explosions in the sacred quiet. They spoke of the man they were taking her to, a man they called the Beast. They painted him with their crude words, a savage, a brute who had broken horses and men with the same impassive cruelty. They said he had bought the ranch with blood and held it with fear. They said he would break her, too. She listened, but the words were like stones dropped into a deep well, the splash was distant, almost irrelevant. She was already broken. What was one more crack in a thing already shattered? The wagon crested a final rise, and she saw it. A cabin, low and dark against the rising sun, a plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney like a single, questioning finger. It was not a home. It was an outpost at the end of the world. His name was Kalen, but the name was a forgotten thing, buried under the weight of his reputation. When he emerged from the cabin, the sun at his back threw him in silhouette, a figure carved from shadow and granite. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, and moved with a deadly economy that made the swaggering postures of the other men look foolish and theatrical. He did not speak. He simply stood on the porch, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the men who had brought his property. The lead man, a greasy oaf named Harker, grinned, showing yellow teeth. "We brought her, Beast. Just as promised. A real sweet thing. Tame, for now." And Harker's gaze slid to her, a possessive, slimy thing that made her skin crawl. Kalen's eyes followed, but his gaze was different. It was not acquisitive. It was an assessment. Like a man judging the grain of a piece of wood or the line of a storm on the horizon. It was impersonal, yet it was the first time in a long time she had felt seen as a thing of substance, rather than a mere surface. He descended the steps, each footfall a soft thud on the dry earth. He stopped before Harker, whose bluster seemed to shrink in the vast space of Kalen's silence. Kalen reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch, tossing it to the man. The weight of coin was heavy and final. Harker caught it, his eyes gleaming. Pleasure doing business. Kalen's response was a slight inclination of his head toward the trail they had just traveled. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. A dismissal. The men shuffled, their bravado evaporating into the thin air. They climbed back onto their wagon, casting nervous glances at the silent man who now stood alone with the woman. As the wagon rumbled away, its noise an intrusion that slowly faded back into the canyon's deep hum, she was left in the dust, standing before him. He did not look at her. He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving the door ajar. An invitation or an expectation, she did not know which. She only knew the silence he left behind was heavier, deeper, and far more terrifying than the noise that had just departed. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something elemental and wild, like damp earth and ozone. It was a space stripped to its essentials, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, a rack of tools on the wall. There was no softness, no concession to comfort. It was a shelter, not a home. He gestured to the corner, where a small cot had been placed. "That's yours." The words were rough, unused. Then he walked to the hearth and began to stir the embers, his attention already elsewhere. His presence filled the small space, a silent, brooding wait. She learned his rhythms as an animal learns the seasons. He rose before the sun, worked until dusk, and ate his meals in a silence so profound she could hear the scrape of his fork against the plate. He never spoke to her, never demanded anything of her. She was simply there, a ghost sharing his hermitage. In her first days, fear was her only companion. She would lie on her cot, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other side of the room, a slow, steady tide that seemed to count down the moments of her life. She expected violence, a sudden eruption to match the reputation that had preceded him. But it never came. His quiet was not the quiet of a predator waiting to strike, it was the quiet of a mountain, immense and self-contained. She kept to her own small routines, cleaning, cooking with the meager supplies, mending the few clothes she possessed. In a hidden pocket of her skirt, she kept a small, porcelain bird, its wing chipped and broken. It was the last piece of a life before this one, a symbol of her own fractured state. She would hold it in her palm when the silence became too much, its cool, broken surface a familiar pain against her skin. She was an object in his house, just as she had been an object on the wagon. Owned. But the nature of the ownership had changed. It was not the leering, possessive ownership of Harker. It was the ownership of a man who owns a field. He does not molest it, he simply exists upon it. One evening, as he cleaned a rifle at the table, the lamplight catching the hard planes of his face, she noticed a long tear in the sleeve of his canvas work coat, hanging from a peg by the door. The frayed edges spoke of a violent snag, a brush with something sharp and unforgiving. She watched him work, his hands sure and steady, his focus absolute. He was a man of immense capability, yet he neglected this small, simple thing. The next day, while he was out on the range, she took the coat down. Her fingers, deft and practiced from a lifetime of such tasks, found a needle and thread in her small satchel. She did not just mend the tear, she reinforced it, her stitches small and neat, a line of order imposed upon chaos. It was not a task done out of servitude, but out of a strange, burgeoning instinct she did not understand. An impulse to fix one small, broken thing in this vast, broken world. When he returned that evening, weary and caked in dust, he reached for the coat. He stopped. His fingers traced the line of her stitching. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her. He simply put the coat on, the mended sleeve a dark patch against the faded canvas. He ate his dinner in the usual silence, but something had shifted. The silence was no longer a void between them, but a space that held a new, unspoken thing. The following morning, she found a block of pale, fine-grained cartonwood on her cot. Beside it lay a small, wickedly sharp whittling knife. There were no words, no instructions. It was not a command. It was an offering. A question asked without sound. She picked up the wood. It was smooth, cool, and full of silent potential. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark in the cold ash of her heart. She began to carve. The knife felt strange and powerful in her hand, an extension of an agency she had forgotten she possessed. Her first cuts were hesitant, shallow grooves on the surface of the wood. She was carving from memory, trying to replicate the broken porcelain bird she kept hidden away. But the wood resisted. It had its own life, its own will. It wanted to be something else. So she let it. She let her hands follow the grain, let the image emerge from the material itself. It was slow work, done in the quiet hours after her chores were finished, while he sat across the room, polishing leather or oiling his tools. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, a brief, assessing glance, but he never spoke of it. The pile of wood shavings at her feet grew each night, a soft testament to her labor. The bird that began to take shape was not the delicate, fragile thing of porcelain. This bird was wild. Its head was cocked, its wings half unfurled, not in a posture of delicate beauty, but in one of imminent flight. It was all tension and coiled energy, a creature of the wind and the high, lonely places. It was a reflection not of what she had been, but of something she was becoming. The act of creation was a quiet rebellion. Each curl of wood that fell away was a piece of her old self being shed, the tame thing, the broken thing, the girl who was owned. Her hands grew calloused, her focus sharpened. The world of the cabin, once a prison, became a sanctuary for this small, sacred work. One evening, she finished. The bird was complete, smooth and perfect in her palm. It felt warm, alive. She set it on the rough mantelpiece above the hearth. It stood there, a small, defiant shape against the dark stone, poised to leap into the firelight. When Kaelin came in, he saw it immediately. He walked to the hearth and stood before it for a long time. He did not touch it. He simply looked, his expression hidden in the shadows. Then, he turned to her. For the first time, his eyes met hers and held. In their depths, she did not see a beast. She saw a flicker of understanding, a quiet respect that was more profound than any praise. The storm came without warning. The sky, a placid blue for weeks, turned the color of a bruise. The wind that rose was not the usual whispering thief, it was a screaming fury, tearing at the roof of the cabin, throwing handfuls of grit against the single window pane. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, brown chaos. A section of the stable roof, old and rotten, was torn away by the wind, the sound a great rending groan. Without a word, they were both moving. He grabbed a hammer and a pouch of nails, she a coil of rope. Outside, the wind was a physical force, trying to push them to the ground. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid, icy sheets. They worked in the maelstrom, a silent, frantic ballet of shared purpose. She held the bucking torp in place while he hammered, his blows sure and steady against the roar of the gale. She anticipated his needs, handing him tools, pulling ropes taut, her small frame braced against the onslaught. In this crucible of wind and water, the distance between them collapsed. They were no longer a man and his possession, they were two people fighting to hold a small piece of the world together. The storm raged for hours and then, as quickly as it came, it passed. The silence that fell in its wake was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. They stood in the wreckage, soaked and exhausted. A piece of flying debris had opened a shallow cut on the back of her hand. Blood welled, a bright crimson against her pale skin. He saw it. He took her hand gently, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly delicate. He led her back into the cabin, to the firelight. He cleaned the wound with a clean cloth and water, his touch careful, methodical. It was the first time he had touched her since her arrival. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that spread up her arm and into her chest. It was not a touch of ownership or lust. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned care. She looked at his face, bent in concentration over her hand, and saw the lines of exhaustion and a deep, guarded gentleness she had never seen before. The beast was a story told by other men. The man before her was something else entirely. Their return was as jarring as the storm. Harker and two of his men rode into the yard a month later, their arrival announced by loud, drunken laughter that fouled the clean morning air. They dismounted, their movement sloppy and aggressive, their eyes immediately finding her as she stood by the water pump. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. She simply watched them, the wooden handle of the pump cool and solid in her hand. Harker's eyes roamed over her, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, look at you. The little bird ain't so skittish no more. The beast been taming you proper." His gaze fell upon the cabin door, where Kaelin now stood, silent and watchful. Harker's bravado was fueled by whiskey and resentment. He had sold her, but he still saw her as his. "We came back for our property, beast," he snarled, though his eyes kept flicking nervously toward Kaelin. "The deal's off. We want the girl." Kaelin did not move. He did not speak. He was a statue of impending violence. Harker took a step toward her. "Come on now, Ilara." Time to go. It was the first time she had heard her own name in this place, and hearing it from his mouth felt like a violation. She saw his eyes drift past her, to the cabin's interior, and settle on the mantelpiece. He squinted. "What's that little thing? You making toys now?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She was never good for much, but I guess she can whittle." The words were meant to diminish her, to reduce her back to a useless object. But they no longer had that power. She thought of the knife in her apron pocket, the one he had given her. She thought of the bird on the mantel, not a toy, but a promise. She was not the same person they had delivered here. The cage had become a chrysalis. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Harker reached for her arm. I said, "It's time to go." His touch was a brand, hot and odious, and it shattered the stillness. It was not Kaelin who moved first. It was her. She drove her elbow back into Harker's gut with all the force she could muster. The blow was unexpected, doubling him over with a grunt of pained surprise. In that same motion, she pulled the whittling knife from her pocket, its blade a sliver of deadly light. The world exploded. Kaelin moved off the porch not like a man, but like a force of nature, a landslide of pure, focused rage. He met the first of Harker's men with a blow that sounded like an axe splitting wood. The man crumpled without a sound. The second man drew a pistol, but he was too slow. Kaelin's hand clamped down on his wrist, and the snap of bone was a sharp, sickening crack in the morning air. Harker, recovering, lunged for her again, his face a mask of fury. He saw the knife in her hand and laughed. "You think that little sticker can stop me?" He swiped at her, but she was no longer the frozen, helpless thing he remembered. She was quick, fueled by a terror that had finally curdled into defiance. She sidestepped his clumsy grab and slashed, the blade opening a red line across his forearm. He howled, more in outrage than in pain. It was then that Kaelin reached him. There was no artistry to it, no theatrics. It was brutal, efficient, and final. He was the beast they had named him, but this was not the mindless violence of a savage. It was the calculated, righteous fury of a protector. The fight was over in seconds, leaving behind a shocking, profound silence. The three men lay broken in the dust. Blood seeped into the thirsty ground. She stood, her chest heaving, the knife still clutched in her hand. Kaelin stood beside her, breathing heavily. He looked not at the bodies, but at her. He saw the blood, the wildness in her eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. And he saw that she was not broken. She was whole. The rumor that would later drift down from the high country was that the sweet girl brought to the beast had been found dead before sunrise, another victim of his violent nature. But they were wrong. It was not the girl who had died. It was the idea of her. The quiet, docile object, the piece of property to be traded and tamed, that was what lay dead in the dust, along with the men who had believed in it. What was born in its place was Ilara, forged in fear and silence, and finally freed by a single, desperate act of violence. As the first rays of the true dawn crested the canyon wall, they began the grim work. There were no words. There was no need. They moved together, cleaning the aftermath of the storm that had just passed, their actions a shared, unspoken right. They dragged the bodies to the wagon, hitched the horses, and Kaelin led them away, down a trail from which they would not return. When he came back, the sun was higher, bathing the small ranch in a clean, golden light. He found her by the hearth. She had taken the broken porcelain bird from her pocket and placed it in the fire. She watched the flames consume it, turning it to black ash. The carved wooden bird still stood on the mantel, poised for flight. He walked to her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He looked at the fire, then at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, stripped of all its earlier roughness. "It's over." She looked up at him, at this man they called beast, this silent, violent, gentle man who had given her a knife and the space to find herself. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were a release, a cleansing. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the carving from the mantel. He held it in his palm for a moment, then pressed it carefully into hers. "This is you," he said. And in the quiet space between them, a new world began. They did not leave. The canyon that had been her prison became their sanctuary. The silence that had been a weapon became their language. They learned each other not through stories and confessions, but through the rhythm of shared days, the cadence of work, the quiet communion of evenings by the fire. He taught her how to track, how to read the sky, how to set a broken bone on a lamb. She taught him how to see the beauty in small things, the way light fell on a stone, the tenacity of a wildflower growing in a crack of rock. She planted a garden, a small, stubborn patch of green against the overwhelming red of the earth. He built a fence around it to keep out the deer, his movements precise and careful. There was no grand declaration, no moment of revelation. Their bond was not forged in a single, fiery instant, but woven slowly, thread by silent thread, into a tapestry of mutual respect and a deep, abiding care. Her hands, once soft, were now strong and capable. His eyes, once guarded, now held a quiet light when they rested on her. The persona of the beast and the sweet cowgirl were ghosts, stories that belonged to a different time, to different people. They were not what they had been named. They were who they had chosen to become. And if you're still here, if you've listened to this quiet story, perhaps you understand. You are not defined by the names others give you. You are not the sum of what has been done to you. You are not a broken thing waiting to be fixed or a wild thing waiting to be tamed. The deepest strength is not found in noise and fury, but in the silent, stubborn act of remaking yourself, cut by cut, day by day, until the person who stands in the sun is the one you carved with your own 2 hands.